They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You can play any and every position. Coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking. And, oh, my goodness. Let's see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're going to have a lot of haters coming at you. But what you got to do is you got to shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Hey, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here at BPM. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. Welcome, one and all who are jumping in now, the remixers, those who will see and hear this later. Welcome and peace to you. Of course, make sure you are staying in touch with, just off the top, make sure you're staying in touch with blackpowermedia.org, finding all the different ways to support the channel as we continue to grow financially, YouTube membership, Patreon. You can donate through blackpowermedia.org. You can find the merch there as well. If that's not of interest to you, or you're not able to, you can just simply like, share, subscribe, and support the channel that way as well. And please do that. Make sure you put the show in the socials and all that as well. So I think I did not have anything. So we will definitely be inviting comments and questions, critiques, queries, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony, calumny, consternation, condemnation, contemplation, consideration as we get into this discussion. So please, peace, Big Teal. Consider preparing yourself for that. And I'm very much interested in having a discussion with our next guest, see his work pop up here and there online and elsewhere, commenting on one or another platform as well. And I've also wanted to honestly get more into both labor and Central and South American politics and struggle. So when our guest sent me a couple of pieces that he had been working on, including his master's thesis, I became very much interested. And it's just a fascinating read into a lot of areas that, again, are of great interest to me, and I think to many of us, but outside of those areas of expertise and focus. Specifically, I'm reading what I believe was submitted as his master's thesis, redefining revolution concepts of Mapuche sovereignty and their influence on the Chilean revolutionary process from 1968 to 1973. And with that, I bring on our guest, Chris Duran. Welcome to the program. It's good to meet you and have you join us. Welcome.
Peace. Thank you for having me on.
So, of course, first things first, the name Duran. I married into a Panamanian family, so obviously I can't help but think of Roberto, and we even named our dog after him, which
Oh, wow.
some people are not pleased with. We got like a family dispute. Some feel like it's disrespectful to name your dog after somebody, and I thought it was an honor. And then the coffee down there, the Panamanian coffee, Duran. So anyway, obviously I'm not asking if there's, I don't know how popular the name is in that region of the world, but that was one of the first things I thought of when I started seeing your name pop up. But anyway, thanks for joining us.
I'm not related to Roberto Duran as far as I know, but yeah, I mean, it's a fairly popular name, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone commented on the YouTube thing, I look like I'm in a CIA or NSA basement. I'm like, damn. Y'all starting off.
Oh wow, yeah. The chat gets rough, man. Sometimes I just turn it. Yeah,
damn,
it's just the lighting. It's just. I would. I would.
My room doesn't have great lighting, man. I'm sorry. I don't have a great.
Well, maybe because I'm reading your work, but I'm thinking of it more as like the opposite end of the political thing. If anything, it's like he's in his guerrilla hideout. Preparing the next.
I'm just in my bedroom, man.
It's
terrible lighting in here, and yeah.
Neither extreme is true. That's all for the case, right? He's just.
I'm just trying to live.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's a lot to get to, so let's just start with some of the basics if we can. If first of all, let me make sure I'm saying the name, the pronouncing the name properly. Mapuche.
Mapuche. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're talking about this group of indigenous people in Chile, in South America. I went and looked at a map before we started. I don't think I've really paid much attention to how I guess there's no norm per se, but it seems like an oddly shaped country that just like a sliver that runs down the coast. So I did want to kind of start there, just some of the basics of the country's history, that region's history. If we could just talk about how Chile comes into being, and then let's talk about the indigenous populations that were subsumed and forcibly put into those nations, those state formations, and go from there.
Yeah. So I mean, like other countries, Chile was created as a colony of the Spanish. So this territory was actually so the interesting thing about the Mapuche is that they're one of the indigenous nations that were never occupied by the Spanish. So about maybe the northern half of what is today Chile was occupied by the Spanish during like the conquest of that landmass. But the Mapuche for several centuries were able to fight them off, and to the point where they established like a border with them, and during that fight kind of consolidated like a sort of national identity out of like several different groups that shared a common culture in that region. And so when the independence wars came, and Chile was thought of as this idea for a nation state, and they kind of demarcated this area that's like between, that left side of the, west of the Andes, with Argentina, and south of Peru. That is when, actually a lot of Mapuche did not side with the independence figures, because they were like, okay, well, we have this relative independence with the Spanish, so why would we risk that for people who want more land? And it's interesting because that might make a lot of the folks who were trying to drag Gerald Horne's work upset about when he was talking about how a lot of the independence folks in North America wanted more land for colonization, and that often made it a bigger risk for colonized people. So, yeah, so typically the south of Chile is where the Mapuche reside, and until the mid to late 19th century, they were independent and not occupied by any foreign power. And it was actually during the consolidation of the nation state of Chile when they were occupied and made a part of Chile forcibly. And it was it's a period of time called the pacification of Araucanía. Araucanía is the area of the south of Chile that the Spanish named, and so it was during during that period when they were occupied, the lands were broken up forcibly and sold to different companies, different emerging Chilean capitalists with different quote unquote small farmers, and there were a lot of Mapuche were placed into I guess what would translate here as like reservations, but they're called reducciones. But basically, small plots of land where everybody lived, and then they would basically go and rent their labor to big, landowners in the south of Chile. So, yeah.
No, right on, right on. Appreciate that. Could you talk a little bit more about this point that you mentioned and that you wrote a little bit about, that they were never occupied by the Spanish? How is that, and how did that happen? How did that lack of occupation take place? What went into that?
Well, there's a lot of theories that people who study that time period. A lot of it has to do with sort of identifying with. Well, I mean, it has to do with the fact that sort of they were occupying a lot of the north of the Andes at the time, and like what was the Incan Empire, and a lot of times what they were able to do is sort of use structures that are already there to then basically place people that are favorable to them in positions of power, and sort of subsume that and have them pay tribute to the Spanish crown. The Mapuche were not organized in the same kind of way as the Inca, and actually resisted occupation by the Inca prior to the Spanish going there. So they resisted being incorporated into that empire and preferred to remain relatively decentralized culture, really relatively decentralized group. And this whole idea of like Mapuche, really, because Mapuche means like Che means people in that native language, and Mapu means land. And typically that describes one area of actually culture, because a lot of times people are demarcated by where they live. So like Pehuenche would be people from like the mountains. Huiliche would be people who live close to the sea. And so this idea of like a Mapuche nation kind of came about through basically, people with this common culture coming together to fight against some kind of empire. And, they were not, they only kind of like appointed some sort of like centralized structure as soon as like there was like a time of like war or something. They were not, they were not organized on that basis outside of that. But in terms of war with the Spanish, what they're able to do is pretty much learn a lot of like, I mean, what would be today be called like guerrilla tactics. They learn Spanish tactics of warfare, and they're able to, counter that through guerrilla warfare, because they were like, okay, we're not going to fight them straight up on the battlefield because, that might not work, because that's the Spanish preferred way of fighting, and they have guns and swords and all these types of things. So they found ways to, combat them, to, ambush their bases. There's a famous, there's actually a famous battle on Christmas Day where they beheaded the Spanish governor, uh, and by ambushing one of the bases that they had set up, uh, intended to conquer the South. And so they got very skilled in terms of like reconnaissance, in terms of sniffing out, which people were like missionaries but sent there as like military, uh, as spies, because there are a lot of missionaries that were sent to the South, uh, that were then taking notes for Spanish military, which is, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of how the UN functions now, but you know, so, but yeah,
And you said
they
they had resisted the Incas as well um and so I mean, so is it largely the same thing, just developing a good military strategy, self-defense mechanisms, et cetera, and so forth, and then what, they were left alone largely or relatively?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much they kind of like established the border and said like, you're not, we don't want to be part of your empire, and this, so at some point, they're like, okay, we're not gonna keep trying to conquer them because they don't, because the Inca kind of had a thing that's, if all you had to do is like pay tribute to us, and then that's it, and worship our gods and all that, and the Mapuche were like, well, we don't want to do that, so no.
So then they resist they resist the Spanish, and as we just did, and then feel free to fill in any of the gaps as you like. As geopolitically South America develops in the way that we know it today, and Chile emerges, the Mapuche maintain a level of independence, and because I know that the at least in terms of headlines and passing, as far as I'm aware, passing references, the struggle is ongoing. I mean, they are still so. Again, long story short, it's essentially they have been able to maintain a level of independence through, assuming a level of this same kind of militarized self-defense that allowed them that level of autonomy even to today.
Yeah.
And then where does things stand today?
Well, they're still struggling for their land back. Essentially, this sort of like very strong conception of nationhood has remained, and it has been a part of struggling against, the Chilean state for a while, especially as I mean, obviously the Chilean state has very strong connections to U.S. imperialism as well. So like, there's a whole continuity of struggling against Western colonialism there, and so the period of time that I write about is focused on like the sort of revolutionary movement in Chile, and how that interacted with these sort of long-standing conceptions of sovereignty, and like what they what Mapuche folks were able to like gain from that. But in the early 20th century, there was like a lot of struggles, particularly around like land titles and things like that. Um, trying to also use like the Chilean legal system to get their land back, which obviously, I mean, the law can say that you're right, but if it's written by folks who have power over you, it doesn't really matter.
And if it
So
only
by
exists to aid imperialism in the first place, then
yeah, so
what
I
difference does
mean,
it make? Yeah.
so by the early 1960s, you have like a whole generation of folks that were like, okay, we're kind of tired of arguing in the courts. Let's just take the land back through land occupations. And you see land occupations happening through the late 50s and throughout the 60s. And you see somewhat similar tactics to that now, just, occupying the land, saying that, naming it the proper indigenous name. And now, the contradiction is against the Chilean state because of this sort of I mean, I guess fast forward to the whole Chilean miracle of, the most successful economy in South America and all this type of bullshit. I'm sorry for my language. But, but with that was like the testing ground, right? If we talk about like Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys and that whole famous story about why Pinochet was put in power there, and um, Democracy Now covers it all the time, even though they don't cover like coups in real time. So, but sorry, I had to
I
throw a little
love
shade
that.
at Democracy Now.
I wasn't going to interrupt that at all.
I'm not as much of a fan of Democracy Now as Dr. Burrows, but nah, but
get him.
I interned there. They suck.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, all right. Hold up.
We'll get to that later.
Yeah. I'm gonna make a note. I don't want to interrupt the flow too much, but yeah, I didn't know that part.
Yeah.
Noting it now.
Yeah. But yeah, so now you have like this massive testing ground for like neoliberalism. You have this massive testing ground for this huge counter revolution that at the same time that COINTELPRO is happening here, you have like Operation Condor in South America. You have like this huge counteroffensive to all these revolutionary, anti-colonial, throughout the global South. And so in Chile, it's no different. And so now in Chile, you have the left. I mean, what remains of the left is not necessarily this organized, powerful left there. They have folks who may run on like leftist party tickets, but there's a sort of alienation from the grassroots. So the Mapuche during this time period of Pinochet, and now, sort of, some of them were like, okay, let's try to get some multiculturalism or diversity through this liberal state once they return to democracy. And you have another strand that continued with very, with direct militant action against the state that just like, okay, well, we had to fight for our land back. And so they have tactics of burning tractors, burning, a lot of equipment by multinational corporations that are continuing to privatize the land there, continuing to destroy the, the natural setting of, the land, planting things that shouldn't be there, doing a lot of like ecological damage to the area. And, again, this is a people that, their name literally means people of the land. So their entire cultural, their entire worldview, the entire framework of life is based around, this connection to the land. And, this sort of capitalist mentality and, civilized framework of living is, completely opposite of everything that they would ever believe in, and everything that's essential to, again, this group of people that have been living there for, millennia, so, now, so, I mean, now, you see, back in 2019, you saw this massive uprising in Chile, this massive set of mobilizations that resulted in forcing a vote on a new constitution. And you saw a lot of Mapuche flags being flown at the protests. So like there's sort of like this consciousness in the background of like, okay, well, now, we should start thinking of Chile as like an indigenous country, which is very threatening to people who don't, all the, what you find in this country is like a lot of folks don't want to like talk, they don't want to acknowledge that side of things, but there's also sometimes the question of like aesthetics. Like you can fly the Mapuche flag, you can say you're for indigenous people, you can say that you want autonomous rights for indigenous people. What does that mean in a material sense? What does that mean when you have this president who is a social democrat, and it's for this new constitution that actually got rejected by a majority of indigenous people in Chile. But, he still sends all the tanks that Biden sends him and all the military equipment that Biden sends him down to the South to, enforce the takeovers of indigenous land. So
right on. So and again, anything that you want us to come back to or to focus on, please make sure we do. In reading your thesis, I was looking, one of the few names that I recognized in the scholarship was the late Rod Bush. And you talk about your use and engagement with internal colonialism theory, something I'm very much interested in. And specifically, I wanted to ask you, because I'm one of the things that drew me to that approach was that I used to, think that I would try to at one point use it to collapse the ongoing gap that I think is unnecessary and misunderstood between the so-called revolutionary and cultural nationalists in Black struggle here in the States. And I thought that the approach of internal colonialism theory allows for a beautiful merging, so to speak, or blending, so to speak, of the cultural and material approaches. So I'm very much interested to hear what your thought of that is and how you saw the theory or internal colonialism theory approach benefiting your work, and if and how specifically the Mapuche have engaged this cultural defense of culture and engagement with socialism, communism, and material struggle.
yeah, I mean, well, that's kind of a lot of different things that go into that. Well, I found internal colonialism useful because, for one, it helps me connect, struggles of colonized people here in the United States to struggles of colonized people also, like, in other countries. In the case of Chile and, the Mapuche, and looking at this specific time period where you have this massive socialist movement, this massive revolutionary movement that's characterized by Allende, um, who was he was elected president in 1970. Um, he was the first Marxist president elected in South America, and that shook up the entire psyche of the U.S. because they're like, oh wow, like a Marxist could win an election. So fast forward to Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales, and so. But yeah, so you have indigenous folks who are relating to this movement around, obviously, worker struggles, peasant struggles. But in the Chilean mindset, it's like, okay, we're doing this around class, we're doing this around, these folks are peasants, and that's the furthest extent of their identity, and that's how we should, unify. And so you have this mass movement that's based around like class and stuff like that, but obviously that race question is not, wasn't fully fleshed out, and so Mapuche organizations had to like force that into the into the leftist discourse, um, which they did successfully to some extent. One of the things that was the big distinction is like, okay, you have like in the countryside you have the whole question of like land redistribution, because you have the sort of plantation system that existed at the time. But for the Mapuche, it's not land redistribution, it's land recuperation. And they defined it as such. They didn't say it was, in all their publications at the time, they didn't say like it's redistribution. They say we're recuperating ancestral lands. And so these were very important distinctions that then came up, and they had to struggle through within like the left at the time. So they had to struggle with these internal contradictions in building this revolutionary movement. When you have any revolutionary movement, it's not like there's it's not like there's contradictions, like all the internal contradictions just like disappear. You have to struggle through that while also countering, the United States, this sort of larger force of like imperial capital, that is characterized then as as the primary contradiction. And so looking at like internal colonialism in Chile, you have to look at how Mapuche folks relate to Chile, um, how they relate to folks in Chile who are largely of indigenous ancestry, but you think of themselves as like Chilean. You know, they're mestizos. They don't want to be indigenous. They want to be whatever. There's a Western conception of what is Chilean, and so with that, you see that confronted at that time period, um, while also facing the contradiction of being what essentially an external neo-colony of the United States and of the West generally, because Chile, like other countries, is a huge source of raw materials for the imperial core. And so I found that useful in terms of like just looking at how, within countries like Chile or other countries in South America or Latin America and the Caribbean generally, you have groups of people colonized within that country, but then also have to struggle against sort of larger colonial structure, um, characterized by the United States.
What does the imperial world get from Chile in terms of resource? What are the primary exploited resources there?
At the time, mostly copper. So
Mhm.
they're the largest copper exporter at the time. So back in the 60s and 70s, it was Chile and Kenya was the largest, I think,
Hmm.
copper exporters. I think now a lot of timber, a lot of like yeah, it's mostly timber now and lithium now.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but especially like in the desert area in the north of Chile, there's like a lot of like mineral resources that is useful for, I guess, guns and U.S. iPhones and I don't know.
You mentioned it. I did want to come back to it. Also, you when you mentioned Operation Condor, could you just, for anyone who is unfamiliar, could you just remind us what that was and how it relates then specifically to what your focus is here?
Yeah. Um, so Operation Condor actually. So okay. So um, this said revolutionary process in Chile um, sort of came to this sort of capturing of a foothold on state power when Salvador Allende, who was, again, the first Marxist president, was elected in 1970. Um, Obviously, the CIA threw millions of dollars in creating front organizations, trying to infiltrate unions to go on strike, which they did successfully in certain cases. Like they got the truckers union in Chile to go on strike and just stopped, all transportation in the country. Um, different terrorist attacks, different assassinations. A lot of the same stuff that if you read, actually, these are all like public documents now. So a lot of the same stuff that you actually see in Cuba, that you see in Venezuela, since 1999, that you see, you know, you still see it today in places like Nicaragua, in in countries that are with socialist governments, um, or even countries that just have somewhat independent governments of the United States. Um, the United States put millions of dollars into sabotaging the country, in the words of Richard Nixon, to make the economy scream. Um, and so they're very open about that. And this all came to a head on September 11th, 1973. Um, so that's why September 11th, it has a very different meaning for me. When the United States sponsored a military coup of the Chilean government, where the military overthrew the government, and then subsequently installed a military dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet, and proceeded to systematically kill, surveil, do everything to the left and anyone that might be suspected of opposing that government, and opposing the imposition of a neoliberal economy. What resulted from this was basically, this was a model for Operation Condor, which was a CIA operation that then did the same exact thing in basically every South American country throughout the 70s and 80s. By the end of the 70s, there was a military government installed by the United States and by, I guess, the right wing in those countries, in every country in South America. So, and, again, this is happening at the same time, obviously, as other counter-revolutionary efforts and, places like here in the United States against, anti-colonial movements, that has resulted in, even today, where we have political prisoners and prisoners of war here in the United States that are the direct result of COINTELPRO. And you have political prisoners from countries like Colombia and that are held here in the United States from Operation Condor. So, yeah.
So the recent Answer PSL BPM endorsed March 18th rally, they were talking about I remember my daughters were with me, and they saw somebody dressed up as Henry Kissinger, some distorted, deformed Henry Kissinger. And they were like, who is Henry Kissinger? And I was like, we'll talk about it on the way home. We don't have time for that right now. And one of the many things mentioned was Condor, that he was a supporter of that. And even as I'm looking at the Wikipedia page real quick, just the Wikipedia page claims 400,000 plus political prisoners, 400 to 500 killed in cross-border operations, 60 to 80,000 suspected leftist sympathizers killed, and they range the dates from 75 to 1989. And then I was just curious, and I just noticed that the film, and people of my age or film buffs may remember this film starring Robert Redford, 3 Days of the Condor, which is a loosely CIA spy thriller movie, came out in September of 1975. So I don't need to get all conspiratorial on a Tuesday on a clear blue skied Tuesday morning.
It's the best time, You look at it. I mean, they said you in the command center, you in the basement command center. You.
But I'm just saying. I mean, it just seemed that one seemed odd. I'm not saying
movies, though. Everything with Harrison Ford in the '80s, that Jack Ryan shit. I forget. There's
it's a whole bunch of them. The Jack Ryan thing started with The Hunt for Red October, and then there was I know the whole series where he's
all those movies back then, all those movies,
and they're still doing it with the dude from The Office is now Jack Ryan on Amazon.
Jim,
Jim
is Jack Ryan. Yeah.
But they didn't. So the film Operation, 3 Days of the Condor is not about Operation Condor. It's just got Condor in the title, and and if I remember correctly, it does involve like some sort of CIA type-ish stuff, but it's not specifically about the operation. It just seems, which would be, because the operation was itself just being launched officially. So I don't know. It just seems, I don't know. And then we do know from the Alfred and Secker book that the first time Central Intelligence Agency is put to use is actually in a film before the CIA took that name from the OSS. So there is this incestuous relationship between all of this in Hollywood, is what I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. But anyway,
I mean, you're the media scholar, so I don't know.
I don't know. It's just fascinating sometimes, you know. I mean, that because I kept thinking Condor, and I was like, I remember that film. Now I'm going to go watch it again.
That's interesting that you brought that up, because I heard of the movie before. I'm like, but I think it's like kind of passingly. But I was like, you know, that does kind of that's weird.
It is
like
weird.
happening at the same time. Yeah,
it is weird. So I'm gonna watch it again, and then and see how if there are any other little tidbits in there. Anyway, so I did want to come back to a little bit of what you were writing in your thesis, because you're talking about this time of late 60s, early 70s. Well, one of the points I wanted to ask is you have a whole section that talks about the role of or at least a section of the section that talks about the role of the press, speaking of media. So I did want you to talk a little bit about both the role of the press in supporting the Mapuche and how they used and engaged press work, and then how that press sort of related to other radical presses of the day. I mean, were they, and to what extent were they engaged with other radical efforts and presses of the day? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I think getting into the archives about, you know, with all that was actually really fascinating. So, I mean, for one, in Chile, typically a lot of the press is very right wing. So the main newspaper, El Mercurio, is, I mean, it's almost lampooned by a lot of Chilean society because it's really like, it's like Fox News, but that's like the main newspaper there, you know. And I mean, there's like a joke. It's called like El Mercurio miente. So it's like, you know, it's always lying. But that has a history of like being very closely associated with the state, very closely associated with colonization efforts. They, you know, even now, I mean, from the time of like the initial like colonization of the Mapuche, talking about them being savages and they have no capacity for civilized thought and all these sorts of things, to now where they have an anti-terrorism law and they just call all Mapuche who like resist, you know, Chilean, you know, the imposition of, you know, corporations on their land. They just call them terrorists, and they're arrested and put in jail like on charges of terrorism, which is, you know, it's like this, you know, it's obviously harsher than any other type of law. So, but in the people who, I mean, if you ask like a right wing Chilean and you know, oh, what do you think about the Mapuche, and they're talking about terrorists, they probably got that opinion from, you know, this fucking newspaper. So, you know, the role of leftist press, particularly in the 60s, you know, this before social media and everything, you know, before BPM, you know, you know, it was very important to try and distribute, you know, information in communities that were related to leftist politics, you know. So one of the newspapers that I looked at was it was published in a city called Temuco, which is mostly you know, indigenous folks living there, and it was closely associated with the Communist Party of Chile. So it was used obviously as a, you know, tool of information for that. The other newspaper that I looked at was called Punto Final, which was associated with a group called the MIR, or Movimiento Izquierda Revolucionaria, or Revolutionary Left Movement, which also, you know, during that time period developed close ties with Mapuche organizations. And, you know, they were more associated with a lot of like radical grassroots movement. But, you know, in these newspapers, they also took a very strong like internationalist perspective. So they tried to relate struggles for land and stuff to, you know, struggles to recuperate land in places like Cuba, or looking at, you know, China or Russia, or, you know, all these other places in the world, all these other communist struggles. There was actually in Punto Final is actually pretty fascinating because there was actually an interview with George Murray from the Black Panther Party, which was when I saw that I was like, oh shit, so there is there was a direct sort of dialogue with folks, all over the world, and he was particularly talking about because he helped organize like some of the first like Black student unions in the Bay Area in California. Um, it's actually talked about in the book like Black Against Empire by Bloom and Martin, and it talks about how he went to he went to Cuba and then he came back and was working at San Francisco State, and he was an advisor to the first Black student union there, and kind of helped them organize and connect them to the politics of like anti-colonial struggle in the Black Panther Party and off campus, which is also a whole other thing. But these types of things were featured in this publication, particularly as they were increasingly dealing with like questions of like race and like anti-colonial struggle and what that looks like, on a global scale.
I mean, and can we come back to that a little bit? Like, what were they saying? Like, how were the Mapuche engaging this still ongoing struggle between preservation of indigeneity and engagement with the so-called modern world, and also what are sometimes dismissed as the white ideas of Marx? Like how have they?
Variety,
are they?
There's a variety of opinions on that last point. Some folks dismiss it as like, oh, this is a Western thing. It doesn't really fit into our culture. Some folks are like, oh, okay, this is Western, but we can use things from it. A lot of, at least a lot of folks that I met they identify as like socialists. They identify as, they've been very well acquainted with Marxist-Leninist politics, is very well incorporated into their own worldview and their own, conceptions of, nationhood and culture. And, obviously they were very much in all of these leftist movements, from the, guerrilla movements against the dictatorship, in the movements that established the socialist government back in the 70s. But again, there's different things. Some folks, and I think I talk about this as sort of in the literature review, some folks are like, oh, well, the left just used the Mapuche for their own gains, or that the Mapuche were very well related, so there's very like varying opinions with that. And so I kind of look at how, again, like conceptions of Mapuche sovereignty that were long held, how they influenced leftist ideas at the time, because it shows up then in the leftist publications, because there's a change in the type of content that is published, and also how ideas of leftist organizations might have influenced the Mapuche organizations at the time. So there was like a sort of dialectical relationship within that, and it's not like this. I don't necessarily take the view that it's like one way or the other. It's sort of there's one term that one Mapuche scholar uses called like they had like a creative tension. That there's a sort of opportunity to out of conflict within within this movement to create something else. And obviously the opportunity was killed by the coup, but and that there is no there really isn't much of a left now in Chile, at least in terms of like organized capacity. But the resistance on the Mapuche has continued on, and a lot of them draw on like communist ideas. Like for one of the more active militant groups, who is headed by someone who is a political prisoner in Chile right now, they have been responsible for a lot of like land takeovers, a lot of sabotages of like just corporate equipment, But they have like a communist discourse and like ideology, and they incorporate it into their worldview. So there's just different ways that they interact with it. Some folks are like, oh well, we don't necessarily need that, but um,
Sounds
yeah,
familiar. Yeah,
yeah.
sounds familiar. Now, who's this political prisoner that you mentioned?
His name is Hector Yaitul. So his last name is spelled Laitul.
Mm,
But that's also one of the things that the struggle for Mapuche political prisoners is also something that they're also able to relate to other indigenous struggles or other anti-colonial struggles elsewhere. So when I was talking to like one person who was a former political prisoner while I was in Chile, she was talking about like, I asked, we talked about Leonard Peltier and, Oscar Lopez Rivera and Mumia. And, she knew who all those people were. And so that's also the point of like connection, that they also relate to other struggles. So.
and it says here he's accused of arson. Is that the official reason why he's locked up? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, he's been in and out of the courts. He's been around for a while, but he's beaten the charges a couple times. But yeah, they put him back in prison.
Mm-hmm.
But his organization does engage with like armed resistance. So, and arson again, they burn things like tractors or things that are responsible of like the cutting down the forest, or these sorts of things like that. So
yeah, right on. Even here in the United States, what little attention I've paid to the Earth Liberation Movement or whatever, even middle class white folks that engage in that work get punished.
Yeah.
The state does not play with these folks. Even if they burn up a truck, or like I mean, they get many years locked up and serious heavy charges for that stuff. Yeah, they don't. The state does not play when you mess with its toys, man. Yeah, that's wild. So just a couple other things that I wanted to raise with you, and then we can come back. Like I said, we can come back to anything in particular you want, and then I have tracked a couple of questions in the chat that and I'll look for some others if folks want to raise them, and if anybody even wants to jump on here and raise it with you directly, I can put the link in the chat as well. But the first is and I'm not sure. I got lost. I wasn't clear enough in the email exchange what you want to do with this piece, but you did send out. Honestly, I don't even remember where I first got it. I'm not sure if we're on a similar listserv together, if you sent it to a group of us. I'm not really sure. And then I was teasing our brother, our dear brother, Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows.
Oh yeah.
When he sent it and said, you might want to put this from Chris on the website. And at first I thought he meant bring it up here. But if you wanted to go on I Mix What I Like, I think that's great. If you have a Medium page, like I said, you probably get more readers. Or we could just talk about it here for a second, because you did send some reflections from where you attended an exhibit of posters related to the history of the Black Panther Party at a place called Poster House in New York City. And I just want to read this one part where you write, one of the most in fact, let me even share this because I got it on let's see, this right here. So let's share this part here. One of the most pressing was the complete absence of any mention of the Black Panther Party veterans currently held as political prisoners in the U.S. What made this especially shameful was the fact that the exhibit even featured the freedom campaigns around Bobby, Huey, Kathleen Eldridge, and the Panther 21 in New York, and Angela Davis's. Yet, while one entire section on the history of the Black Power, was dedicated to the work of H. Rap Brown, Jamil Al-Amin, there was absolutely no mention of him currently being a political prisoner. What one would come away with was that there were political prisoners in COINTELPRO back then, but somehow not today, and somehow it is not part of the direct legacy of the party and the movement. Also shameful was the conclusion of the exhibit, which again, while directly speaking of the legacy of the party, made no mention of political prisoners of war. Furthermore, it claims that the primary reason of the party's collapse was discrimination against women and corruption, as opposed to defining what were internal contradictions compounded by the direct assault of the state. So I found that to be a very compelling section. It resonates very much with my own views of what I see happening around in the world. So I wanted to give you a chance to say any more about that you wanted to, or to elaborate on any of those points, draw connections, those points to Mapuche's struggle, if you see any, or yeah.
So there is no national liberation movement that does not also demand the freedom for political prisoners. I think you definitely had Daruba on here a few times say that. You've also had him say that, a lot of young folks are disconnected from like the history of these movements. It's unfortunate, and the other part of like that same paragraph was that in that same conclusionary piece in the exhibit, it then went on to talk about how the direct, like sort of like the inheritors of the Black Panther Party is like the Black Lives Matter movement, as started by people like Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors, and so when I read that, I was like, damn. So my uncle was in the Newark chapter of the party. His name is Adno Smith. He's actually in but he's in this book right here. But one of the main things in terms of, you talk about the legacy of the Black Panther Party and what should be primary in a lot of organizing today is freedom for political prisoners, generally, because there are younger folks, including folks who rose up in rebellion in Ferguson, who are political prisoners, folks who are resisting Cop City that are political prisoners, but folks who are elders of the movement, who are forcibly disconnected from the communities where they're at. And again, one of the main aims of COINTELPRO explicitly was to disconnect young people from their, from these revolutionary elders, and to stop the sort of the transference of like knowledge of like organizing and anything that would help build, a movement, to resist the state, to resist capitalism, to, gain freedom for colonized people, for working people, so on and so forth. So with this exhibit, I was like, and at first I went into it like enthusiastically, because like I had learned about it through a People's Forum thing where they had a talk with Rosemary Mealy, who I love, and she does a lot of great work with like Cuba Solidarity. She's a Panther veteran herself. And then I'm looking at the exhibit, and it's like, okay, it's curated, it's consultant. It said it was they consulted with like several Panther veterans, in making it. But I'm looking through a lot of the stuff, and it's like, okay, they have a lot of great content. They're talking about socialism, they're talking about anti-imperialism, they're talking about political prisoners at the time. They're talking about H. Rap Brown, and I was like, okay, and that was the first red flag. But I'm like, okay, they have a whole section on H. Rap Brown, and then they don't say nothing about him being in prison right now. I was like, okay, well, and then they get to the Panther 21. I'm like, okay, this is cool, And then they get to the conclusion. I'm just like, so the direct legacy of the party isn't the fact that they, it fell apart primarily due to like corruption and discrimination against women, and not like those aren't internal contradictions that are like, again, that are not compounded as a result of this massive assault. Like, you can't explicitly say the government destroyed the Black Panther Party, you know, and that was frustrating. And then, like, again, when you're talking about the legacy of the party and how it lives on today, it's like it lives on today in the fact that these Panther veterans are still fucking alive. They're still around, you know, and half of them, you know, like there's, I don't know how many are still in prison. And I think there's 6 or 7 that are still in
I'm
prison.
not sure the number at this point, but yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
I know at some point there was 11, but folks, you know, who were in these organizations or associated organizations, you know, the direct legacy is that they have been political prisoners, that they have been disconnected from movements, you know, intentionally, and that, you know, like Daruba says, a lot of young people are not working with, you know, they don't have any memory of, and there's a saying in Chile actually, that a people without memory is a people without without knowledge of the history is a people without memory. You know, they have no ability to go forward, and so that's why, like in you know, in Chile, it is very like much a thing where they keep re-emphasizing like the coup, but they're still in a process of recovering a lot of their memory because of the fact that it had, like, that period of time has disrupted so much, you know, and has disconnected young people from a lot of those lessons. And I think that, I don't know, I'm not one of those people who, like, you know, I'm just impressed by the aesthetics of things. Like, oh yeah, it's cool, so you shouldn't criticize, you know, the fact that these things were left out of an exhibit that is inherently political, that you're talking about the Black Panther Party, and the fact that, again, the responsibility of those who say that, you know, who want to fucking dress up and, you know, take the name of the Panthers, their main responsibility should be to free the political prisoners that were actually in the party, and then try to help them actually be in organized spaces in their communities to help bring those lessons from that, you know, to young people today. And there's a lot of opportunities that are missed when you don't when you don't do that, you know. You know, there's a lot of public platforms now where people get to talk about the party, and if that isn't, you know, I would hope at the least, like, you know, a lot of the proceeds from the exhibit go to political prisoners commissaries, but, like, again, that this there has to be some kind of, you have this public forum, you should be telling people about this. At least that's my opinion, but I don't know.
No, I appreciate, you know, I mean, just when I was just looking at the Wikipedia page when we brought it up a little bit ago for Operation Condor, I gotta actually like study this for real. I've never actually studied that operation for real.
Yeah.
But the numbers are staggering. So when you're talking about the ongoing impact, I mean, I know it's not just in Chile, but the entire region, tens of thousands of leftists wiped out. It's going to have a lasting impact on what versions of history get passed on. And yeah, I mean, like Daruba's also said, BLM is Black Liberation Movement. So I mean, anyway, so listen, before I get to the questions and some more seriousness, and then unfortunately I do have to wrap at 1:00 Eastern here, because you know, 4 classes a semester every semester.
That's terrible.
So,
okay, that's
nice.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I do want to take a moment for that little bit and earn my title here, my petty title here. I got to hear about this intern piece at Democracy Now! I think, honestly, I haven't watched Democracy Now! In a minute. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed. What'd you say?
I knew you were coming back to it.
Yeah. I made a note. I wasn't playing around. As soon as you said, I made a note. I mean, I haven't watched in I honestly haven't. I don't even know how long. It's been a very long time since I've watched. And with regularity, it's been even longer than that. And which is, I admit, is somewhat sad because I mean, going back, to the. I mean, for me, it was, I don't know, the mid '90s. When did they start? I don't even know when they started, but for me, that's when I started becoming aware of that show. And increasingly its importance. And at one point, I applied to work there when I was in grad school, in like around 2000, I think, somewhere around there, 2000, maybe 1999. And anyway, but so it's just disappointing to see and to still hear about where it is now. But what was your experience like?
I don't think you don't fit the skin tone to be in the production room for Democracy Now. You can start there. They are.
That says a lot.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. So so I applied for the internship because they pay well for a part-time job. So I give them that. But I applied there because I was like, oh shit, like Juan Gonzalez works there, and obviously group. I'm an admirer of the Young Lords. When I followed what content I did watch on Democracy Now had to do with stuff like the Young Lords, and a lot of that was like my first exposure to stuff like that. But I don't really reference them too often as a main source of information because they're liberal as fuck. They regularly cite like CIA sources for things on like Syria and Iran.
Is this
and
the case
Russia
when you were there? When were you trying?
I was there when the coup attempt in 2018 in Nicaragua was happening.
Wow.
And they had the fucking coup plotters in the studio, and like one of them said hi to me. I was like, bro, I want to kick you out the window because like it was so crazy because like you have covered the coup in Chile before, and it's like literally all the stuff can be broken down as to how they go about it, and you're seeing it happen in real time in Nicaragua. And you could put in a little effort to like debunk some of these things, and you didn't do anything to do that at all. And they just literally have like these little, what's it called? National Endowment for Democracy folks, funded folks like in the studio talking about how Daniel Ortega has become authoritarian dictator and all this bullshit. And, he's not a real Sandinista anymore. And, it's like literally like you have coup plotters doing the same shit that they've done in every example. Literally, and I don't even have to go through all, in every example. You can look in Venezuela, you can look in Cuba, you can look in Chile, you can look in, wherever that, they're talking about they're protesting for democracy and freedom and all this, freedom of the press, and the press is fucking owned by some billionaire who wants his lands back and shit. It's like, it's such ridiculous shit that's so easily debunked. I even tried to link them to articles debunking some of the things, and they weren't receptive to that. The entire production team is all white. There's sort of this weird cult of personality around Amy Goodman. I don't want to. They be dick riding her like crazy. Till the wheels fall off, it's like they worship this white lady god, and they have a Spanish department, which are like the only little bit of like ethnicity there, but it's like their job is to like basically translate everything that the white folks tell them to translate.
Yeah, right. They're not producing new knowledge. They're translating existing wisdoms into Spanish. That's deep.
And it's like I wanted to work there because like Juan Gonzalez, but like he's like half retired, so like he's like I was like he clearly doesn't like he's not like the main person calling the shots there, and I'm pretty sure he retired now. I think he's moving to Chicago or something, but yeah, it's just like the whole thing was just the cult of Amy Goodman, and it's like again like just the liberalism there, they were talking about, like, she always had like this like little speech prepared to talk to, because I worked in the education department, so they'd have like different uh, schools, or like people bring their classes or like little community stuff, there, and then we talk about media literacy and all this sort of stuff. But she'd have like this little speech prepared talking about like all states lie, and I'm like, well, I don't want to, like, because it's like, like, okay, like, all right. I don't know. There's a really great article on Hood Communist called, like, "All States Aren't Bad."
Mm.
There's something to that title, and it's you can't be liberal with that kind of stuff. There's distinctions. You can't. This very unprincipled to be like, oh well, all states are the same. Like Cuba is the same as the United States. Venezuela is the same as, like, it's like, no, like, there's qualitative differences, like, in the way things happen. You can't just.
So in other words, so the point was, we can't be specifically or especially critical of one or the other, or particularly the United States, because everybody lies. Was that that's
I mean, they take it a step
that's
further and
interesting.
they cite sources like the White Helmets when they're talking about Syria and stuff like that. It's like, oh, we're critical of Assad. I was like, well, y'all are more than that. Y'all are doing the work of MSNBC, except for the ostensible left in the United States. So
Anyway, well, yeah.
I mean, I don't want to, I don't want to complain too much, because
Oh no,
Todd will get mad at me, because
no, yeah, no. Let Todd get upset. This is we used that. Man, anyway, that's my man. But one of my favorite moments in my career was when he shared an office literally right next door, and we used to just in between classes be going at it over these issues, just like because his thing is, as a writer and a journalist, he always wants to defend writers and journalists to make all the mistakes that they want or whatever, and I'm like, man. Anyway, but yeah, so I'm never one to put the lid on criticism and hate for democracy now, like the one, anyway, so I don't, but let me not, I don't want to, I don't know.
Listen,
I don't want to drag
I'm
you down.
I'm not as big a hater as Todd, though.
Yeah,
I remember the award he won the other year for dragging half of African Studies elders on the Zoom.
Oh yeah, no,
that was hilarious.
Yeah,
I was watching that live. I was like, oh.
One. Yeah, he's out here trying to win another one too. Yeah, Juan. One of these days, I gotta figure out a way, like, this conversation I once had with Juan got to be told one day. I gotta somebody put me in touch with Juan so I can get his permission. it got to be shared. But anyway, a couple of more substantive and meaningful comments or questions have come in. Big Teal, shout out to you. There are socialists in Chile who see there are Mapuche extremists, like some DSA members. Is it true that there are fighting factions in the Mapuche nation that are more radical?
I'm not sure if I understand the DSA reference, but
so Big Teal, are you saying that yeah, I'm not entirely clear either now. But are there factions within the Mapuche nation that are considered more centrist or liberal in the way that DSA members are seen by actual socialists? Maybe that's what Big Teal meant there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I mean, there's kind of like there's a couple of different strains of, like, the way that Mapuche organizations, like, demonstrate their resistance and claims to sovereignty. The two main strains are, like, those who are more militant and engaged with, like, direct action or, like, armed struggle, So I guess those would be the folks who are like more radical, quote unquote. And there are those who look to work more with the state and try to like carve out legal, uh, carve out rights for Mapuche people within that. One of the criticisms of that from a lot of Mapuche organizations was the fact that these folks are kind of like, they don't communicate a lot of what they're doing in these state organized spaces to grassroots communities. They don't, there's a disconnect. There's an alienation from what demands are actually coming from communities that are then translated to what could be pushed for, in the legal field. And so, I mean, it's not dissimilar to how a lot of nonprofits in the United States run. There's a disconnect between the actual communities and the policies that are being shaped in, government offices and stuff like that. I mean, like the new constitution had things like ideas like plurinationalism, which is something that comes from Bolivia, but the difference in Bolivia is that it came out of a workers' movement that, has, has resulted in like this, the socialist oriented government. And in Chile, where there wasn't like this huge indigenous workers movement, in that same way, where it's coming off of a very, broken system because of the coup, a very fractured left, a very, it's just like, okay, now we want to be plurinational. And it's like, okay, but what organizations on the ground in Mapuche territories, what did they ask for this? Or are they just saying, no, just give us our land back? And so if you look at the results of the plebiscite, they voted on a new constitution. People were perplexed because like the majority of like provinces in the South where indigenous people live overwhelmingly rejected the new constitution because they felt like they were not consulted. And they had the option. Again, what killed me about progressives, they were all excited about Chile. It's like, oh, this is the most radical thing, that redesigning the constitution. But it wasn't really done through a grassroots process. They had a bunch of appointed, officials that people elected to like, they were representatives that would then draft the constitution. They did not necessarily do it through a real grassroots process where they had communities come together and like discuss these ideas. And, it's sort of done to assuage like this, this massive uprising that happened, at the time. But you can compare it to actual grassroots efforts of people rewriting their constitution in places like Venezuela or places like Cuba, where they, organized people at the grassroots. They had people come, in different, communal settings and like discuss what they, what proposals to put into the process. And, there's a much more democratic process than what happened in Chile. And that's also a large part of why, why it got rejected in Chile. Not just, from the indigenous folks, but like from folks generally, because the left was not able to organize on that in a mass way. They were not able to push, they were not able to push more radical ideas with that. And the current president, he's like the social democrat, but he shitted on like the left repeatedly on like the Communist Party, the Socialist Party in Chile, particularly for their positions defending places like Nicaragua and Venezuela. Because if you look at the statements by the current president of Chile, he has all the smoke for Nicaragua, for Cuba, for Venezuela, and while again he has political prisoners in his own country, so I don't, and he, gets his little high five from Biden, and he gets to be the cool hipster leftist, DSA dude who, comes to roll, comes and does talks at NYU with his sleeves rolled up, showing off his little tattoo on his arm, and, yeah.
Hey, what can I mean, what am I going to say in a country where the first black president was deemed so because he played saxophone on Arsenio Hall? What am I going to say about rolling up a sleeve for a tattoo? You know what I'm saying? Like, Yeah.
Didn't know that was going into a Bill Clinton reference. I was like,
um, right on. It sounds the same elsewhere. A quote I've heard attributed to the Mapuche is, "We are not defending the land. We are the land defending itself." I like that. That's dope. If that's in fact correct. Let's see. Can the guest speak on the relationship between the Mapuche struggle and the social movements that brought about the revolution in the 70s, in the early 70s, and the revolutionary leftist groups of the time, like the MIR?
yeah.
And please tell us who the MIR it was or is. I'm not familiar.
Yeah. So the MIR is the Movimiento Izquierda Revolucionaria, which
Oh, right.
is
Yeah.
a revolutionary left movement. Okay. So the government of Salvador Allende consisted of a coalition of parties called the Unidad Popular, or Popular Unity Coalition. The MIR was not in this coalition. They preferred to remain sort of outside of that. They were sympathetic towards it, but they wanted to engage in radicalizing the grassroots in a way that they felt like these traditional parties of the left were not able to do. In the late 60s, folks from the MIR started to become more involved with Mapuche organizations and Mapuche like communities who were engaging in land takeovers in the south of Chile, as a part of their their efforts to try and, I guess, have that be a part of this revolutionary process and sort of orient it more towards the left and all that. What is interesting about their publications is that, again, in the late 60s, you see them referring primarily to this question of peasants in the South, on that distinction of them being peasants on this class basis. After that, especially in 1971 and 1970, where you see like this huge explosion of like land takeovers, you know, which they helped to organize. They helped to, bring like arms from like cities down to those communities so they can defend themselves from the landowners who would often hired like armed guns to like try and terrorize the Mapuche after they took the lands. Um, they, but like in their publications, they just they started to feature a lot more Mapuche organizers discussing race in Chile and discussing like indigeneity in Chile, and this whole idea of indigeneity being part of it being essential part of the identity of these workers that worked in the countryside. Um, what's interesting though is that that they they'd often take over like these lands and then name it after like famous revolutionaries like Che and stuff like that. There's one book here, it's in Spanish, but it's talking about the engagement with these communities, because they formed an organization called the Movimiento Campesino Revolucionario, which is basically revolutionary like peasant movement, which was like the arm of that organization that was oriented towards the countryside. But they would have Che's face everywhere. They would have it oriented towards like a lot of, they would name things after Lenin, after Che, after all these sorts of things, after famous revolutionaries, even in Chile, or even after a lot of like Mapuche like historical figures that fought against the Spanish. And so they kind of use those names like interchangeably almost. But yeah, I mean, these and although like a lot of like Mapuche organizers join the MIR in particular because they thought it was like it was just the opportunity for them to engage with the sort of revolutionary front group. And but again, these things did not happen without struggle internally. It wasn't just like they just joined and they all got along. They had different, they had different worldviews. They had different ways of approaching life. Again, the Mapuche are connected to the land in a way that is different from the average, like, Chilean. So,
by the way, what is when you mention that they talk about race in Chile, what are the demographics now as they're defined? How is race delineated, and what are the breakdowns as far as you happen to know or off the top of your head remember?
I'm not really sure if I remember that well. So I know it's like they have like category of like white, mestizo, and like indigenous are like the primary like categories. I mean, the majority of the country is, mestizo, or it would be characterized as like, oh, they're a mix of like Spanish and the indigenous folks. Obviously, most of the upper class folks they look like they're from Sweden or something. And there's also there is an Afro-descended population in Chile. There's historically a relatively small population from the time of enslaved folks being brought to Chile. Although not many were brought there, just because it's like it's over the Andes. They were like, we're not doing all this, but
it's a lot. It's a lot.
And also, I mean, they also couldn't conquer the countryside, so they were like, okay. But there's also a rising Afro-descendant population because of the fact that there's a lot of like immigrants from other parts of like Latin America and the Caribbean, and that's also like big question now of like racism like in Chile, because folks, I don't know if you ever look at Haiti and the DR, there tends to be a lot of anti-blackness there, so that's not different in Chile when a lot of folks from Venezuela or Colombia or Haiti or the DR come to Chile, and they're noticeably darker. And like even in the last presidential election, there was a guy who said, the guy who ran against the current president, first of all, he's a brother of one of the Chicago boys who were the economic advisors trained in the United States to Pinochet, and he's also the son of a Nazi officer from Germany.
Oh wow, damn!
And he made comments like he wanted to build a moat around Chile to like prevent immigrants from coming in. So yeah,
damn.
Yeah. So Chile's a pretty right-wing country in terms of its political activity. Just who can really be president there. So, but which is again not unlike other Latin American countries, and not unrelated to the fact that the U.S. has made sure it's that way. Because if it's not that way, then there's a problem. So.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't messing around when old boy said Latin America is their backyard. I mean, they're really not messing around, and that's why I do even recognize, especially even when I even travel a little bit, even just to Panama. I mean, you can feel the difference. And I get why it would be harder to do. Like you can't do what we're privileged here for sure. Like you can't do everything that we do here in terms of organizing overtly that you can do that. I mean, you can't do that there. So, I mean, I don't know. All respect to revolutionaries in that part of the world and in those similar parts of the world where, I mean, even, like we have a big problem with people just talking trash, but you can't even do that there. Like you can't. So I guess in a I don't know, in an odd dialectical way, maybe that makes it so you're more likely to get real revolution down there because there's no room to talk trash. Like,
I mean,
I don't know, man. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean,
I hope so.
Folks
That's
do it.
Yeah.
I think more folks are just. I don't know. I guess more folks are maybe just aware of like the contradictions and like the fact that they organize based on survival, and it's not just organizing around personality cults or nonprofits or social media pages, so
yeah, right
but,
on. Anyway, listen, Chris, you're welcome back anytime. Please continue to send me your work, and even if I say, as I say to you publicly, it takes me way too long to get to it, because it's been a minute, but I appreciate the contributions you keep making, and I want to engage them some more. So I really appreciate you coming through. And please, if there's anything else you wanted to drop on us, please do. Or if there's anything you want to let us know, how folks can follow your work or where they can expect to see it or what have you.
I don't know if they follow my work. I'm not a scholar like that yet, but I would encourage folks, if they haven't already, to tap into the National Jericho movement. One of the main things, again, that should be primary in any type of organizing is an emphasis on political prisoners. That should be a primary component of any type of mass organizing that folks are doing. If it's not, if not the primary focus of an organization itself. But I think, I would finish with that. I think that if anyone wants to really connect the past to the present, to draw correct historical lessons on revolution, to build principled organizing spaces, they have to center political prisoners, and they have to put these elders who were around in community with the folks that you're dealing with, because otherwise, like I said, there's a lot of cosplay, a lot of a lot of different things that are not necessarily productive. And so tap into the National Jericho movement, tap into the National Alumni Association of the Black Panther Party, donate to political prisoners commissaries. Free them all.
Right on. Chris, thank you very much. The remixers have called for it, so we definitely have to make sure you come back, and I appreciate you. Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for having me on.
Anytime, my man. Take good care. Talk to you soon.
You too.
All right, everybody. Big shout out to Chris Duran, living up to his last name. That was strong. That was a strong conversation. Right on. And thanks to those who were able to join us here live and direct, and those who will see this and hear this later. Thanks to you as well. Please make sure you continue to support BPM in all manners and ways that you find comfortable, freely, by liking, sharing, subscribing, following us at blackpowermedia.org as well. Please, if you do have any ability or interest in supporting financially, you can become a member of the channel, support via Patreon as well, if you prefer, or find all forms of support at blackpowermedia.org. So thank you all in advance and after the fact for those who already have done that. All right, so I'm off to class, and then after that, I've already found where it is. I'm going to watch 3 Days of the Condor, and then I'll be back to let you all know how much of it overlaps with the history of Operation Condor. And if anybody has, I should have asked Chris while he was here, if anybody has good sources on the history of that operation, please send them my way as well. Thank you all very much for honestly, I don't know how to do that, and I don't know how that works. So maybe I'll look into that. If I can, let's do it. I'm down with that. Thank you all very much for coming through. Please continue to support the platform. Go back if you missed it and catch the remix from this morning. We'll be back tomorrow on the Remix Morning Show as well. A bunch of stuff coming up on the platform, so make sure you got the bell clicked as well. All right. So like Fred Hampton used to say, to you, we say peace only if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. Catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.